In the summer of 2008, a painting of grass was taken off a museum wall in the Netherlands, packed, and driven to a particle accelerator in Hamburg. 30 by 40 centimeters. Nothing in it but blades of grass, a few small flowers, and the flat green of a field. It is one of the least remarkable things Vincent van Gogh ever made. And for 2 days, a beam of X-rays half a millimeter wide crawled across it, 2 seconds at a time. They were not looking at the grass. They were looking through it. An older, blurred radiograph had already caught something underneath, and it was not a flower or a correction. It was a jaw, a cheekbone, the shadow of a face that no one had been able to read for over a century. What that beam finally pulled out of the paint is the thing we come back to before the end, and it changes what this canvas is. Look closer. Because to understand why a face is buried under a lawn, you have to go back 3 years and 600 kilometers to a Dutch village called Nieuwenen in the winter of 1884. The village sits about 40 kilometers south of the city of 's-Hertogenbosch in the flat southern province of North Brabant. Vincent's father, Theodorus, has been pastor of the Dutch Reformed Church there since 1882, and in December of 1883, his eldest son moves back into the vicarage. He is 30 years old. He has no income, no wife, no reputation, and no realistic prospect of any of the three. He is living in his father's house, and he decides, in that house, to become a painter of peasants. What he starts in the last days of October 1884 is not a series of portraits. It is closer to a campaign. He goes into the cottages of Nieuwenen, sits down in front of farm workers, and paints their heads, over and over. By the end of February, he has finished 30 of them, and across that single winter, the total climbs to roughly 40 painted studies of peasant faces. Look at what he is actually chasing. The women of Brabant genuinely wore white headdresses in those days, stiff white caps that sat over the hair and framed the whole face. Van Gogh was fascinated by them, and the reason is technical rather than sentimental. The cap catches the light. The face beneath it does not. He is hunting the collision between a bright white shape and a human face left half in shadow, which is one of the hardest things in painting to get right. In his own words, those heads with the white caps were difficult, but he called them eternally beautiful. He works by lamplight, inside the cottages, at night. That detail matters more than it sounds. A single lamp in a low room throws hard light onto one side of a face and drops the rest into darkness, and the paint he uses to hold that darkness is the color of soil. Browns, deep reds, a palette so heavy that it looks less painted than dug up. This is the man who has not yet seen a single impressionist canvas. And there is a problem building around him that has nothing to do with paint. On the 26th of March, 1885, Theodorus van Gogh dies suddenly. He was 63. Vincent keeps working. Within weeks, he pulls all those heads together into the large composition he had been building towards, a scene of 5 people eating potatoes around a kitchen table by lamplight, finished in April and May of that year. It is the first thing he ever makes that he considers a real success. It is also the last major work he will complete in the Netherlands. Now, hold that thought about the 5 people at the table, because one of them is going to matter enormously. Of all the peasant heads Van Gogh painted that winter, only one sitter has ever been identified by name: Gordina de Groot. A farmer's daughter from Nieuwenen, born in 1855, unmarried, in her late 20s. She posed for him repeatedly. She appears in at least 6 other paintings besides the potato scene, and she is one of the figures at that kitchen table. Every other face in the series is anonymous. 40 studies, 40 people who sat in front of him in their own homes, and 39 of them have no name attached at all. They are not anonymous because he did not know them. They are anonymous because nobody wrote it down. Then the gossip starts. Word goes around Nuenen that Vincent is having an affair with Gordina, who is by then 30 years old. She is unmarried, and she is pregnant. The local Catholic priest suggests publicly that the artist is responsible. Vincent denies it flatly. He writes to his brother that a girl he had often painted was having a child and that they thought it was his, although it was not him. And he goes to the mayor to complain that the actual father is a member of the priest's own congregation. Whether or not anyone believed him, the damage lands where it hurts most. The priest had already been eyeing the studio Vincent kept next to his church with open suspicion, and now he forbids his parishioners to pose for the pastor's son. Think about what that does to a man whose entire working method depends on ordinary people agreeing to sit still for him in their own kitchens. The supply of models simply stops. The campaign of heads ends, not because Van Gogh finished it, but because the village closed its doors. On the 24th of November, 1885, he leaves Nuenen for the Belgian city of Antwerp. He never returns to the Netherlands. He never sees Gordina's son, who was born a month earlier and registered with no father's name on the certificate. He leaves the country. The heads go with him, or rather, some of them go ahead of him, because in the spring of 1885, while all of this was closing in, Vincent had been packing up studies and shipping them to Paris. His brother Theo was working there as an art dealer, and the arrangement between them was blunt. Theo sent money, Vincent sent work. On Monday, the 6th of April, 1885, 12 days after burying his father, Vincent writes to Theo about exactly this. He says he is sending the studies as they come straight from the cottages. Then he adds something that reads, now like a man arguing with a jury. People will say they are not finished, he writes, or that they are ugly. Show them anyway. So a small group of those dark Brabant heads travels to Paris and ends up in Theo's hands. Theo does not sell them. Nobody in Paris in 1885 wants a lamplit study of a Dutch farm worker's face painted the color of dirt. Theo's own view, communicated to his brother more than once, is that the work is too dark and out of step with what is selling, which at that moment means the bright broken color of the Impressionists. The heads go into a drawer, or against a wall, or into a stack. They wait. And in February of 1886, Vincent arrives in Paris himself. Here is the part that turns this from a biography into a case. When he walks into that apartment, the studies he mailed from Nuenen are already there, waiting for him. They are not lost. They are not in another country. They are in the same rooms he now lives in, stacked within arm's reach, unsold, unwanted, and suddenly surrounded by a city that has just shown him what color can do. He is a man standing in front of his own recent past with a brush in his hand and almost no money for materials. Canvas costs money. He has almost none. So look at what he does. In 1887, out in Asnieres, a village northwest of Paris, where he goes to paint in the open air, he sets up in front of a patch of ground and produces something that could not be further from Nuenen. No people, no lamplight, no brown. He picks a close-up of grass, an extreme low crop of the kind that turns up constantly in the Japanese prints being traded all over Paris at the time, and he zooms in until the field fills the frame. Every brushstroke lines up exactly with the thing it represents. One stroke, one blade, one stroke, one stem, one stroke, one petal. Grass. In color. It is a technical exercise, and the museum that owns it says so plainly. It is a man teaching himself a new language, one stroke at a time, in a canvas measuring 30 by 40 centimeters. There is no story in it, no figure, no drama, nothing to decode. Which is precisely why, for well over 100 years, visitors have walked past it, and why nobody thought to ask what was underneath. Except that the Kröller-Müller Museum's own record of the painting contains a sentence that should stop you cold. Van Gogh, it states, reused a canvas he had already painted on some 2.5 years earlier in Nouenen. And it goes further. X-ray photographs, it says, reveal the head of a woman in a cap beneath the grass. A cap, not a hat. A cap. Now here is where it stops being a curiosity about one painting. Van Gogh did this constantly. He would take the canvas of an abandoned work and paint a new composition directly on top of it. And specialists estimate this is the case in roughly 1/3 of his early paintings. 1 in 3. That is not an accident or a one-off act of frustration. That is a habit. He is not a man who once painted over something. He is a repeat offender, and the evidence is hanging in museums all over the world. Which raises the obvious question, and it had already been raised. The shadow beneath the grass was not a secret. A study of the radiographic images of Van Gogh's paintings in the Kröller-Müller and the Van Gogh Museum, published by Schra van Heugten in the Van Gogh Museum Journal in 1995, had it on record. Researchers knew a head was down there. They just could not see her, because a conventional X-ray gave them a smudge. A vague, colorless suggestion of a skull shape floating in a field with no eyes, no mouth, nothing that could be read as a person. The features could not be made out at all, which meant the woman under the paint was, in the language of the report, far from identifiable. They had a body and no face, and for 13 more years, that is exactly where the case sat. The reason they could not see her is not that the machines were weak. It is that they were asking the wrong question. A conventional radiograph works on absorption. It measures how much of the beam gets stopped on its way through the object. What stops an X-ray in a painting is heavy metal, and in 19th century oil paint, the heaviest thing in the room is lead white. So the picture you get back is essentially a map of where the lead is, and everything else, every pigment used in low concentration, every compound built from lighter elements, vanishes into the background. The technique does not distinguish between layers. It flattens them. That is the trap. When a radiograph passes through this canvas, it passes through both paintings at once and hands back a single blended image, the grass and the woman fused into one gray ghost. There is no way to tell the beam to ignore the top layer. So the head that Van Gogh buried and the field he buried her under arrive superimposed. And the result is exactly what the earlier researchers described. A shape with no readable features, a person who cannot be identified. What was needed was not a stronger beam. It was a beam that could answer a completely different question. Not how dense is this, but what is this made of? And that question has an answer because Van Gogh's palette is chemically extraordinary. His pigments run from organometallic compounds through transition metals to heavy metals, covering, as one summary of the research puts it, virtually the entire periodic table. Every color he ever squeezed out of a tube carries a chemical signature. Cinnabar means mercury, Naples yellow means antimony, zinc white means zinc. If you could map where each individual element sits on the canvas, you would not be looking at a blur of two paintings. You would be looking at pigments, one at a time, and the buried woman would separate herself from the grass automatically because she is not made of the same stuff. That is the idea. Executing it requires a particle accelerator, so the painting travels. It leaves the Kroller-Müller Museum in Otterlo and goes to the Deutsches Elektronensynchrotron in Hamburg, to a storage ring called Doris III, and to a station on it known as Beamline L. This is a micro X-ray fluorescence instrument capable of working across energies from 5 to 80 kilo-electron-volts. The team fires a pencil-thin beam of quasi-monochromatic synchrotron radiation at the center of the canvas, tuned to 38.5 kilo-electron-volts, with a spot measuring 0.5 millimeter by 0.5 millimeter. Then they start moving it, point by point, across an area of 17.5 by 17.5 centimeters. Run the arithmetic on what that means in practice. 2 seconds of exposure at every single point, at 0.5 millimeter resolution across a square roughly the size of a paperback book. The scan takes 2 full days. For 48 hours, a beam of light crawls back and forth over a 120-year-old landscape of grass, and at every stop, it excites the atoms in the paint until they fluoresce and give up their identity. The instrument is not making a picture. It is taking an inventory. And 3 elements start appearing where they have no business being. Mercury, antimony, zinc. All 3 cluster into the same region. All 3 trace the same shape, and none of them belong to the meadow on top. Mercury reads as cinnabar, the vermilion red that gives flesh its warmth. Zinc reads as zinc white. The antimony is the strange one, and it needs a second technique to pin down. Using X-ray absorption near-edge spectroscopy, essentially a chemical fingerprinting method run on selected points and compared against reference samples, the team establishes that the antimony is present as Naples yellow and that it sits in the lit parts of the face. The lit parts of the face. There is one more element, and it is the coldest detail in the whole scan. Underneath everything, spread flat and even across the whole area, they find a homogeneous layer of lead. That is a whitish primer. It is not part of the woman, and it is not part of the grass. It is the coat of paint that Van Gogh brushed across her before he started the landscape. He did not simply paint on top of her. He covered her first. He put a layer between them. Then he assigned each element a color and let the data build the image. What comes out of that reconstruction is not a smudge. It is a face. The tritonal image, built from the antimony as pale yellow and the mercury as red, delivers the flesh tones of the hidden portrait with the brushstrokes visible and with physiognomic detail the earlier radiographs could never touch. Eyes, A nose, a mouth, a chin. A woman with her head covered, staring out of a layer of paint that had held her invisible since 1887, rendered in browns and reds beneath a field of green and blue. After 121 years, she has a face again. The work was not done by one person, and the names deserve to be said properly, because this is the moment the case cracks. Joris Dijk of Delft University of Technology and Cohen Janssens, professor of chemistry at the University of Antwerp, led the team. With them were Geert van der Snicht, also of Antwerp, Luc van der Loof, of the Kroller-Müller Museum itself, Karen Rickers of the Deutsches Elektronensynchrotron, and Marine Cote of the Center of Research and Restoration of the French Museums at the Palais du Louvre, and of the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility in Grenoble. The findings were announced on the 30th of July, 2008, and published in the journal Analytical Chemistry on the 15th of August that year. Speaking on American radio days after the announcement, Janssens described what they had recovered as a fairly detailed picture of a Dutch rural lady. And that phrase is the hinge, because the reconstruction did something the science had not promised. It made comparison possible. The rebuilt face could finally be set beside Van Gogh's known work, and it slotted straight in. It belongs to the extensive series of heads from Nuenen, from the winter of 1884 and 1885. More precisely, the researchers concluded it must belong to the smaller group of those studies that Vincent handed over to his brother in Paris, the ones documented in his own letters. So now you know what he hid. The question is why he did it. The answer the team put forward is not a mystery. It is an economy. 2.5 years after painting her, Vincent arrives in Paris, walks into a world of bright broken color, and finds the woman's head hopelessly old-fashioned. That is the phrase in the research, hopelessly out of date. She represents everything he is trying to stop being. Meanwhile, the object she is painted on is a stretched canvas, and canvas costs money he does not have. So the somber head of a provincial Dutch woman becomes the support for a colorful Parisian floral landscape, and the transaction is complete. He did not destroy her out of anger, he recycled her. And here is the cruelty of the arithmetic, in numbers that were unimaginable to everyone involved. Those unsellable Brabant heads, the ones Theo could not move, the ones people called ugly. In October of 2024, Christie's sold one of them, head of a woman with white cap, for £1,855,000. The portrait of Gordina de Groot went further. It sold at Christie's in February of 2023 for £4,842,000 against an estimate of 1 to 2 million. And in 2024, the Noord-Brabants Museum bought it for €8.6 million, nicknaming it the Mona Lisa of Brabant, and raising the money with help from 3,000 private donors. He could not give them away. Now a country crowdfunds to keep one. There is a final detail, and it is the one that stays with you. The woman under the grass has never been uncovered. Nothing was lifted, dissolved, or removed. She was never rescued. What exists is a chemical map, a portrait made of mercury and antimony, a photograph of an absence. The actual paint, the actual face, the actual woman whose name nobody wrote down is still exactly where he left her, under a layer of lead primer and a field of grass, in a gallery in Otterlo, being walked past. The painting insists there is nothing there. It has insisted for well over a century, and it is very good at it. That flat green field is not a landscape, it is a lily, and it is the most honest thing Van Gogh ever made, because he was doing what all of us do. He looked at the version of himself he had outgrown, decided it was embarrassing, and painted something brighter over the top of it so he could keep moving. She is still under there, and so is yours. If you want to keep looking where everyone else stops looking, subscribe. There is another canvas that pulls exactly the same trick, hanging in plain sight, and the second painting hidden inside it was found on the back rather than beneath the surface. That case is waiting. See you in the next one.